I remember reading that Frank Sinatra once said that he felt bad for people who didn't drink. He said because when they wake up in the morning, that's the best they're going to feel all day long. So I woke up this morning after a night of wine and matzah and said to myself, I have 7 more days ahead of this, and this is the best that I'm going to feel this morning. A few months ago, I read a biography about Galileo Galilei. And of course, Galileo was famous for shattering the Copernican view of the universe that, everything revolves around us. I mean, from a physics standpoint, it's true. From an emotional standpoint, we're still struggling with that. But Galileo was pursued his entire life because he challenged what was then a scientific orthodoxy that the church had. And he was pursued to the end of his life. We know that also Giordano Bruno, one of the great medieval philosophers, was burned at the stake because of ideas and beliefs that he had. We know that throughout the course of European history, that many people felt that they would give up their standing and their wealth and their position and their acceptance in society in order to hold on to their beliefs. Some of them gave up their lives. Many of them ended up leaving Europe. The story of people leaving Europe for the old world, for the new world, is well known to us. We know that starting from the early 1600s, that Huguenots and others were leaving Europe to make their way to the United States. We know that following them, that there were Dutch people who also left. English also people abandoned England for what was then the New World. And we might think that them leaving the old world for the new world was them believing that they were going to abandon a dark and repressive past for a hopeful future. If you thought that, you would be wrong. Because from the Dutch to the Huguenots to the English, the Protestants, they didn't think that they were leaving a dark past for a bright future. You know what they thought? They thought they were leaving Egypt, and they were going to Canaan, the Promised Land. And they believed that by crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they were parting and going over the Red Sea. The story reverberates even deeper, I think. You see and you understand by listening to even the speeches of Martin Luther King. We know that the early founders of the United States saw and found great encouragement in their mission to free themselves from the yoke of the burden and the oppression of the British Empire. So much so that 2 things stand out. One, that Benjamin Franklin, in one of his early writings supporting the revolution against the British Empire, he wrote that rebellion against oppression is obedience to God. And on that flyer, because he was also a printer, by the way, was a picture of King George III. He also had suggested that on the back of the American dollar bill, today, of course, it's a pyramid and whatnot, but he also suggested that it should be the image of the Red Sea parting and Moses leading the Israelites through it. Long and short, of course, that the early Americans believed that they too were fleeing from a pharaoh and they were building a new promised land. And that centuries later, Martin Luther King came and he repeated the story again. He said that they were Americans who were enslaved. And that the founders, so to speak, the foundation of American society were the pharaohs. And Martin Luther King went throughout the country saying, "Let my people be free." In other words, what was the amazing thing what Martin Luther King did? He took the story of the original founders of the country and he turned the story against them. They were no longer the Israelites seeking freedom from the Pharaoh, but they were the Pharaoh. and the African Americans, the black Americans, they were the Israelites. What's the story here? You know, some people perhaps were sitting at their table last night, and maybe there were a few cynics amongst you, none of you, by the way, but maybe there were a few cynics amongst you who said, is this story really true? Did the Israelites really leave? Were there that many of them? Oh, come on, tell me about the plagues. Were there really 10 plagues like that? Did the Red Sea really part? Is any of this, or is all of this true? And for those who ask the question, I respect a good cynic, by the way. But the question misses the mark. The question isn't whether the story is factual. The question should be at your Seder table, is the story true? And the story is true. We see and hear repeated over and over again throughout the course of human history, people seeing themselves inspired by the story of what the early Israelites went through their slavery and then their ultimate redemption and freedom out of Egypt into the Promised Land. The totality of the story is important because first and foremost, we hear of a people who are oppressed. And then we hear of them being freed. But that in itself is not sufficient. That is not enough. Because at the end of the story, we hear that they are brought to where they are meant to be. It is not simply a story of a people being taken out of a bad problem. It is a story of a people being redeemed and brought to their end, to where they should be. This story, heard over and over again, made me think of something. You hear the story of the Exodus from Egypt. We tell it every year. It fills our prayers every day. And in fact, you see that there are two perspectives to the story. There is what the story is saying, and then there is what people believe the story to be. What is the story actually telling us? The story is telling us that the Jews live in a violent world where there are people who want to do and have done horrible and terrible things. The deputy foreign minister of the state of Israel from years ago, Abba Eban, of a certain generation, people will remember him. He once said that Jewish history is filled with things, horrible things that are difficult to imagine, except they came true. And then on the other side of the story, that people see not necessarily what the story is telling, but what they feel the story is teaching them. And what's the story teaching them? This broad, universal story, speaking to not only Jews, but to all human beings about their inherent rights to live without the yoke of oppression, without the jackboot of tyranny. That people have the right to be free. That people have the right, the spiritual and physical ability of movement and expression and of freedom. And I asked myself this morning, which is the truer story? Is it the universal story, or is it the particular story? Is it the world story, or is it just a story for the Jews? To be fair, there are certainly Jews who believe that the story is meant to be a message only to the Jews, that the world is a dangerous and violent place to the Jewish people. And as a result, what we should do is lock ourselves behind very big walls. And on the other side of that wall, carry very big guns. And be wary of a dangerous world that is surrounding us all the time. And on the other side of the spectrum in the Jewish world, there is the opposite reaction. That we should embrace the larger world. That our story is a story of all human beings. That we share a common humanity and a common destiny. That the story of what Passover is telling us is not speaking to the Jews alone, but to the entire world. And so we should jump to the other side of the wall and carry our stories with them and then mix in with everything else. Now, those are the two sides of the coin. But the truth is, I think that most people are this and that. I think most people are both particular and universal. I think most people are hybrids. That they both understand what the story of Passover, of the Exodus from Egypt, is speaking to them as a Jew, and they also understand and appreciate what the particular idea and the inspiration that the story of the Exodus from Egypt can be felt throughout the world. That while it is a story about Jews, it need not remain only a Jewish story. I came to this conclusion of sorts because I remembered one of the early lines to be found in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. Not surprisingly, there was a book written about 2 years ago about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. It ultimately went to a committee, no shock. There was a committee working on it. They broke out into many, many fights. No shock there too. Some people resigned, who could be shocked, and then they came back. And then ultimately what they ended up doing was hiring an American Jewish lawyer, a young guy who had just moved to Israel. Well, the state wasn't yet founded yet. And he began drawing together all the different versions that people were fighting on. And they created this kind of, this alchemy, so to speak, version. And then it ultimately went to Ben-Gurion and the committee, and they approved it. And in this Declaration of Independence, there's this one statement that says that in the land of Israel, the Jewish people were born. And it's where we came to life. And it is where the book of books, the Bible, gave birth to the spiritual and to the ethical story of the Jewish people, and which then was given over to the world as a whole. The Jews, all of us sat last night at our Seder table and we read the story of Passover and we felt that it was our story. But here's the particular and the beautiful little switch that happens in the Jewish world for thousands of years. We see it as our story, and we are happy not only to see people learn from it, but that they should see it as their story too. Chag Sameach.